Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. You may not have ever heard of Dr. Herbert Needleman, but a week or so ago, or a week and a half ago, July 18th, he died. 2 weeks ago, I guess. He was 89 years old. He was working in North Philadelphia after medical school, working in a community psychiatric clinic. Benedict Carey wrote a great piece about this in the New York Times. It's sort of a eulogy, but it's in the science section. Dr. Herbert Needleman, who saw lead's wider harm to children, dies at 89. And, well, I'll just read a little bit of this to you that Benedict Carey wrote. The boy approached, he was working in the community psychiatric clinic in North Philadelphia when he met a young man who had become a touchstone for a crusading career. The boy approached Dr. Needleman and explained his ambitions, which were large, even as the boy struggled with words. He was bright and open. Nonetheless, he had deficits that struck Dr. Needleman as similar to those found in children with lead poisoning. I thought, he said in a later interview, how many of these kids who are coming to the clinic are in fact missed cases of lead poisoning? Now, the problem they had at that point in time was there was no easy way to find out exposure to lead. But what they knew is that exposure to high doses of lead caused, again, quoting from the article, mental lapses, even permanent brain damage and death. But what about the low-level exposure? No one knew, right? Nobody knew what the consequences of this were. And there was no easy way to find out how much lead a person had in their body because it ultimately, gets into the body. You ingest it, you inhale it, you breathe it, you eat it, or whatever, and it gets into your bloodstream. But eventually, where it ends up is in your skeleton. And doing a biopsy where you drill a hole through, a kid's arm into their bone and pull out a piece of the bone to determine how much lead exposure they've got was, inhumane and painful. So nobody had ever really done the epidemiology. So what Dr. Needleman figured out was that teeth are part of our skeleton. I mean, it is conventional wisdom. He didn't figure this out, but it occurred to him. Teeth are part of the skeleton, and when kids are 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they're losing their teeth. So he started playing tooth fairy, essentially, saying to parents in this community in was it Pittsburgh or Philadelphia? In Pittsburgh, saying, I'll give you money for your children's teeth. You can play tooth fairy, give the money to your kids. And here's what he found: children living in poor urban neighborhoods had lead levels 5 times higher on average than did their peers in the suburbs. He published a paper in 1979 in the New England Journal of Medicine, which included more than 2,000 children. And they explained the associated consequences in devastating detail, writes Benedict Carey in the New York Times. Children whose accumulated exposure to lead was highest in the group scored 4 points lower on an IQ test than youngsters whose exposure was at the lowest end. Teachers rated the high-exposure children as having a host of classroom issues, including attention deficits and behavior problems. And then they did a follow-up, and there was a correlation between lead levels and reading delays and lead levels. And now we've seen, studies on lead levels in criminality and lead levels in violence. So when you expose children to lead, you are pretty predictably setting up a problem with misbehaving, poor learning, and violent children. Flash over to an article by Michael Hawthorne on February 8th of last year in the Chicago Tribune. Now, keep in mind, this was a year and a half ago. This was made public. The headline, City Fails to Warn Chicagoans About Lead Risks in Tap Water. As Michael Hawthorne writes in the Chicago Tribune on February 8, 2016, more than 2 years after federal researchers, and keep in mind, this is a year and a half ago, more than 2 years after federal researchers found high levels of lead in homes where water mains had been replaced or new meters installed, city officials still do little to caution Chicagoans about potential health risks posed by work that Mayor Rahm Emanuel is speeding up across the city. By the way, this is not a knock on the mayor. This is not. In a peer-reviewed study, researchers at the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, found alarming levels of the brain-damaging metal can flow out of household faucets for years after construction work disrupts service lines that connect buildings to the city's water system. Nearly 80% of the properties in Chicago are hooked up to service lines made of lead. And the city, when questioned about water quality, officials said the city complies with the lead and copper rule. This is a 1991 law. But the rule, this federal rule, only requires that 50 homes be tested every 3 years in Chicago, a city of 2.7 million people, with more lead service lines than any other U.S. city. Moreover, the rules require utilities to check only the first liter of water drawn in the morning. Now, here's why that's problematic. The lead is in the service lines. In other words, it's in the water pipes out in the street, right, and in the lines coming up to the house. It's not in the house. So when you first open the tap in the morning and you take your first liter of water out, your first, fraction of a gallon of water out, you're getting the water that was sitting in the copper pipe in the house. You're not getting the water that was sitting in the lead pipe out in front of the house. To get that water, you've got to run your water for a couple minutes and give that water time to move from the street, from the lead pipes in the street, into the house and out the faucet, because it has to displace all the water that's been sitting in the house overnight. So the methodology is screwy. Makes no sense. In fact, he notes in the article, the first liter of water is often lead-free. High levels of the toxic metal can flow through taps for several minutes afterwards. After years of hearings, a group of EPA advisors issued a report in December that concluded the current rule masks widespread but little-known threats to public health. And they say, he writes in the article, the only way to guarantee the public is protected is to make it a national priority to remove lead service lines altogether. This is according to the EPA panel. They wrote a letter to Gina McCarthy, who was the head of the EPA at the time, saying revisions to the rule alone are not sufficient to address this critical issue. The removal of all lead service lines will require significant financial resources and time. During this time, it's essential to have in place a robust effort of consumer education and engagement to ensure protection from exposure to lead in drinking water. And the EPA says any household with lead service lines should flush pipes for 3 to 5 minutes anytime water hasn't been used for several hours. And then they point out toward the end of the article, a 2015 Tribune investigation reveals it remains a pernicious problem, it being lead contamination of water, in the same poor, predominantly African-American neighborhoods in the west and south sides that have given Chicago a national reputation for violence and academic failure. So Dr. Herbert Needleman passes away. He's the guy who woke us up to all this stuff. And, what are we doing about this? Not nearly enough, in my humble opinion. Not nearly.